Buenas tardes a todos. Les damos la bienvenida a esta instancia que es la instancia de los paneles de las sesiones paralelas de la 34 Conferencia Internacional de Autoridades de Protección de Datos. Aquí estamos para atender el panel de geolocalización pública y privada. Los dispositivos de geolocalización son aplicaciones a la medida de nuestras necesidades y nos permiten obtener información en tiempo real a través de un simple dispositivo conectado a Internet. ¿Dónde vamos a cenar? Quizás sea una pregunta que no nos hagamos más. Si pensamos en prospectiva, en poco tiempo estaremos usando con cierto grado de masividad la geolocalización para nuestras actividades cotidianas, para llegar al trabajo y evitar una zona de congestión, para saber cuál es el cine que nos ofrece la película de nuestro gusto o para conocer cuál es el clima reinante en la zona en donde nos estamos trasladando. Aparecen las aplicaciones de geolocalización cada vez con mayor fuerza y a la medida de nuestras necesidades. Permiten que podamos obtener en tiempo real información a través de un simple dispositivo conectado a Internet. Eso puede ocasionar algunas repercusiones en nuestra privacidad. Por eso es importante analizar cuáles son los riesgos que estos servicios pueden generar y cuáles son las dificultades entonces que ellos nos ofrecen. Para poder despejar estas interrogantes nos acompañan en el día de hoy como moderador de este panel, el señor Christopher Olsen. Como expositores vamos a tener la presencia del señor Peter Jarre, la señora Beatriz Rodríguez. También nos acompaña Endre Giososabo y el señor Pat Walsh. Así que los invito, les doy la palabra. Gracias.
Thank you for that introduction. My name is Chris Olson. I'm an assistant director at the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel. I just want to start by introducing the fellow panelists. Pat Walsh is the Director of Privacy for the GSMA. Beatriz Rodriguez is a member of Information Law Institute at Republica University. Peter Jarre, to my right, is the Federal Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information in Berlin. Andre Szabo is the Vice President, National Authority for Data Protection and Freedom of Information. So we have a challenge today. The challenge is to make sure we keep everyone engaged. We have a difficult spot on the agenda right after lunch and without the benefit of coffee. So that's our first challenge. I would like to set the panel up briefly with some few remarks, and then I'll have Andre and Pat also have a few remarks. And then my hope is that we have a long period of time where we can have a engaged discussion among the panelists and with audience members as well. So why are we discussing the subject today? The use of geolocation is indeed pervasive. Just a few years ago, it would have been inconceivable to think that hundreds, if not thousands, of commercial enterprises could know your location at any point in time or over time. Similarly, governments would have had difficulty tracking precise movements of suspects or citizens. They need to have police officers actually follow people on foot or in cars. But the landscape is entirely different today. Mobile devices allow hundreds of thousands of commercial companies to collect and use location information of users. And the application environment is very new on mobile devices. I think the application environment started about 4 years ago on Apple and Android devices, and now there are close to 1 million, if not more than 1 million, applications available on those devices, and many of them do make use of location information. Law enforcement is able to access cell site data on a frequent basis to identify the location of citizens and suspects. A lot of the location uses obviously bring great benefits to users. Individuals can find services very easily, very quickly, wherever they are. Users can check traffic conditions, weather conditions. I'm sure many of us were checking weather conditions on our smartphones this morning when we woke up to see the cyclone outside. Many offers can be provided to users as they are simply walking by stores or walking through malls. So in many ways our lives are richer, but these benefits also come with risks. And these risks may not be well understood by users, and indeed we don't think these risks are well understood by users in many cases. One risk that people don't usually consider is use of information out of context. We had a couple of different applications available in the United States in the past few years. One was called Girls Around Me. It was an application that was developed to collect information that girls had posted publicly on location-aware services like Facebook and Foursquare. These girls were likely posting information so that their friends could see where they were, so that they could create social connections. But an enterprising developer created an application so that other individuals could collect this information and find out where girls had posted their whereabouts, and had marketed this service as a way to find unsuspecting girls and potentially draw a connection to them. It was a fairly creepy application, and it did not survive very long in the marketplace. Another service that many of you may have heard about was called pleaserobme.com. It was a website that collected information about postings that individuals had made of their location on various location-aware services. Just to make the point that these sorts of services may be used in an entirely different context than the users are thinking of when they're choosing to share their location. Another risk that this conference is focused on is a risk associated with profiling, or some have called it boxing. Is data used to create a profile about a user that limits the information the user is then privy to? Does it limit the information the user can see that might expand the user's universe? Your offers may be limited to offers that are based on your prior preferences or habits. Freedom of association is another important risk to the prevalence of geolocation information collection and use. Citizens are used to being able to associate with whom they like and not having that information immediately accessible or easily accessible to others. And this information may also be used for decisional purposes. If I, for example, have a smartphone and I visit my local bar 3 times a week, and there is a company out there collecting information about user habits, and that indicates that the average individual visits a local bar 1.5 times a week. Is there an insurance company out there that might be interested in knowing about my prevalence in visiting bars so that they can factor that into rate setting? What do the users know about this sort of decisional information? Personal freedoms can also be challenged in the government surveillance context. There's a big debate in the United States courts today over what the reasonable expectation of privacy is for users with cell phones. And the government is arguing in a number of contexts that access to cell site data is important for law enforcement purposes, and that citizens do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that data. So we'll see how that shakes out over time. So these are just some of the risks and benefits we'd like to address today in the discussion we're about to have. We'd also like to talk about how traditional privacy protections that exist worldwide based on the fair information practices can apply in the mobile context. It's a small screen. Are transparency concepts easily applicable in the mobile space? And how do we resolve some of the dilemmas that we're going to identify? So first, I'd like to have Andre Szabo provide a brief presentation. Pat Walsh is then going to go next, and then we'll start with some questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here with you today in Uruguay, in a country where freedom is very much wished and appreciated. As you can see, I wear national colors today, and it is not by accident. Red, white, and green, these are the Hungarian national colors. And this is also a symbol which is linked to our identity, which is very much close to freedom. Today, there's a national holiday in Hungary. No one is working in Hungary, just we here in Uruguay. This is the day of the outburst of the 1956 revolution. I'm sure you have heard about it. It was a huge revolution in a small country against the Soviet occupation. Now, in Hungary, we celebrate this day. We remember our wish and our war for freedom. And even though this revolution and the subsequent war for freedom failed, it was a huge step towards the end of the Soviet occupation in our country, which finally ended only in 1991 when Soviet troops left Hungary and, of course, surrounding countries in that region. So we Hungarians are quite sensitive if it comes to our freedom. History has proved that if it is about our freedom, we are very much sensitive, and we are sometimes less sensitive if it comes to the freedom of others. The Hungarian history proved that statement as well. It is fair to add at this point. So and coming back to Punta del Este, here we celebrate freedom and also privacy. Privacy is, and freedom is, absolutely contrary to total control. Dictatorships and total control go hand in hand, like freedom, democracy, and fundamental rights go hand in hand. If we are speaking about freedom of countries and nations, we must recall that freedom of individual, a basic value we share, and this panel is also dedicated to the issues related to individual privacy and individual freedom. Freedom is not a reality without genuine privacy, freedom of expression, and other fundamental rights. Now we are talking about geolocation, both in public and private context. The permanent surveillance of the geographical location of individuals is a means of total control. This is my approach. This is a means of total control. That is why it is a most sensitive issue from the privacy point of view. If we have a look at the technology, and I'm not an expert of technology, but I just raise the issue, of course the details are very much complicated, but the end is quite easy. I know where you are. I can point at you on the map. As regards the legal side of it, I have the right to know where you are. So the basic question is, when do authorities, companies, individuals have the right to know the exact location of other natural persons? When looking for legal answers, of course, you have a look at legal texts, regulations, and so on. First, you search a national one. You won't find specific rules. In Hungary, for sure not. You cannot find very specific rules at international nor at European level. If no specific rules apply, then we have to turn to our well-elaborated data protection principles. They will give general answers to our general questions. At this point, and I don't want to go into the details, and I don't want to bore you with this. I only highlighted a set of conditions relevant in this field. It is my understanding that all these requirements are relevant, not just in Europe, but also in other countries on the globe, if it comes to geolocation. However, further to the general questions, we have very specific questions. If controllers or data subjects turn to the data protection authority, they never ask, what are the principles? The question is, in my case, in my specific situation, what is your answer? So therefore, I propose to look into the details as regards specific relationships. Employers. When preparing my presentation, I asked one of my colleagues to send me some materials on this, and my colleague mentioned in the email that this is, so we have an old opinion on, as regards employment purposes, the use of geolocation for employment purposes, and slowly, employers and controllers start to understand it. Telecom companies offer easily available services to give the locations of mobile phones. Mobile phones are, of course, always with the employer. The same goes for cars. What is the answer, the specific answer, concrete answer? If it is really justified in the concrete case, I mean that it is crucial to know by the employer where the employee is, then the collection of such data, not related to the data subject, but to the tool, may be justified. It is a case-by-case exercise. And it is often raised, if I have a mobile phone, I use my car for private purposes as well. How do we switch off the technology? It is often raised that it is impossible or very difficult. Our view is, again, clear-cut. Privacy cannot be suspended, so technology must be suspended. If you solve that the technology is on, then please solve that the technology is off out of working hours. This is a clear message from our authority. Again, another issue, the protection of children and elderly, and whether geolocation data about them may be processed. Well, I often have the impression that new technology is used as a toy, also amusing adults. Once technology is there, then our fantasy starts working, and let's spy on someone just for fun. Of course, I accept that the protection of children and elderly is more than justified. It is not a question. But it is even more important to discuss it in detail, since it is a very vulnerable group of people. As it is outlined in many decisions of the Hungarian Constitutional Court, the data subject must remain the subject and not the object of the surveillance, of the data processing operations throughout the whole processing. And this is clearly applicable in this case. We only accept it if a direct and compelling circumstance justifies the surveillance, the collection of geolocation data. Briefly about logistics. Here I refer to several different branches of economy. The main point is the more the collection of personal data is linked to objects and not to data subjects or natural persons, the more acceptable it is from the data protection point of view. Another example, which is not optional, this is about prisoners. Geolocation data were processed about prisoners in old time as well. So it was well known by the authorities where the prisoners are. So this is not something new. But if it comes to less stricter rules, or, for example, less serious cases, that the prisoner must not anymore kept behind bars, but still the surveillance, the location of the prisoner must be kept by the authorities, then the processing of geolocation data may be justified again. Of course, human dignity here in this case is quite a sensitive issue, how to solve all the details of the processing, but in principle, our authority is not against this idea. And one more example, and this is me or you, but on the slide it's me, since I'm not a prisoner, but I'm only an innocent user of my smartphone, which I was given from my employer at the end of this year. At the beginning, of course, I tried to set the most privacy-friendly settings. But since I use navigation system, I'm a countryside boy, so I use navigation system in Budapest to find a way to different places. Of course, I use navigation system. And then I am in the trap, so whenever I open my map, I'm pointed by my smartphone. One of the speakers today at the plenary session referred to a survey when 30% of the users declared that he is not willing to use certain mobile applications due to the privacy concerns. Well, in this case, if I'm in the 70%, who knows which stakeholders are processing geolocation data about me? Well, frankly, I don't have a full list of these stakeholders. Is it a problem? Yes, it is. The processing is excessive? Yes, it is, because it is not acceptable from the very basic principles point of view. Purpose limitation principle, data minimization principle. It is not acceptable in this way as it is exercised in the daily business as I experience, and I'm sure many of you experience it. Well, I stop here. These were my remarks as an introduction. I try to indicate that as an authorities we would like to come to exact answers because we are questioned in this way, and I hope my presentation triggered further thoughts and we will have a useful conversation on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. It's a good discussion of legal standards. I think we're going to hear a bit of a discussion of best practices now or self-regulatory measures from Pat.
Have you got the... Okay, so I'll stand up if you don't mind. But my name's Pat Walsh. I work for the GSM Association. It's a global trade body that represents 800 mobile phone operators around the world. And between them, they connect over 6 billion mobile users. And I think we should bear in mind also when we have these discussions, which are often framed by concerns in Europe and in America, that less than 2 billion of those 6 billion are in the so-called developed Western economies. And where the future in mobile is in those emerging economies. So let's not just keep our mindset in the US and Europe. Could I ask how many of you have a smartphone? Put your hands up. Wow, lots. How many of you have your smartphone protected by PIN access? Would you mind getting your phones out and unlocking them and passing to the person next to you? Why? Why won't you do that? Because it's personal and private, isn't it? You don't want someone else poking around in your business, in your history. Well, hey, guess what? Mobile users are the same. So I think we're at a stage, aren't we, where we are going from old to new paradigms. I mean, I'm only off blonde, by the way. This really isn't grey. But I do remember this one on the left here. I used to have a big battery that you have to carry around to make a phone call, didn't you? And this is where regulation is still stuck. Here, on the left, regulation seeks to address infrastructure and mobile cellular technologies, when the reality is that most people are over there on the right. That little device, what does it say? It has the computing power superior to computers needed to send a man to the moon in 1969. That's how powerful this is. And you've got a correlation of power in the ability to collect, analyze, and use data too. So why is it that we're still here on this left-hand side when we're seeking to regulate things like cellular location data, infrastructure and technology, when the reality is that most users of mobile devices these days are enmeshed in a very complex global relationship, a global relationship. And we talked about, some of this title is about public and private. Here's the thing Chris mentioned, pleaserobme.com. Here's the latest version of it. It's weknowyourhouse.com. And this is it's a social networking privacy experiment to demonstrate to people that, what you thought was private is public. Now, one of the questions I have, and Peter Shah's here, is, and I don't know if Jakob's there as well, is the degree to which you can regulate for this. Because this isn't just a matter about the law, this is about the fact that privacy controls and transparency were not sufficient to help people become aware that in a particular context, and Chris mentioned context, and context is key, in a particular context, that there was a need to make a decision. It was a case of, oops, they didn't realize in many cases that their tweets here and other postings were geotagged from their mobile devices. Some had actually, yes, posted their details and said, I'm not at home, I'm not at the flat. I've taken their addresses out here to protect their privacy. But this is, again, where education comes in to play. And I think we need to make it easier. So I have a smartphone. I can geotag my camera. I like to know where I was when I took some photos. So I had some equipment I wanted to sell and put on eBay, some nice music equipment. And I put it on eBay, and eBay do a very good job of protecting your privacy. And I suddenly thought, whoops, was that picture I've just posted geotagged? And guess what it was? So I used a little tool that not only showed a satellite photo of my house, thanks to some internet players, but also a map of where I lived. So I had to take it off and put it back on again. Now, that's because I hadn't used the geotagging feature for a little while. So the law can't cater for my interest. My interest is I want the company that develops a service that allows me to become aware when it's important to me and to change, give me a privacy dial, is the one that will get my business. And the law can't always cater for these contexts. I'm aware that I haven't got very long, Chris, so I'm going to hurry through some of this. So technology is reshaping concepts and values. So what is location? So we've got GPS, we've got wireless LAN, we've got cell ID, whoopee. So you've got cellular location data. If it's on 2G technology or 3G technology, it can put you up to 32 kilometers or 22 kilometers, depending on how many cells there are and how close they can get you positioned. But GPS, put me down to here. Wireless LAN can put me inside buildings. There are entities busy creating indoor location services to connect to smartphones. Is it my MAC address? Is it my IP address? Is it my postcode? So in the UK, I noticed Steve's here, in the UK, for example, under freedom of information legislation, there's a piece of case law that determines that the last digits of your postcode amount to personal data. Because I live in a village, for example, of only 164 houses. If you have that postcode, you put it precisely down to my house that's linked to my name. So we have to think differently. So what is location now? Location's not just my longitude, it's not just my latitude. Where am I now? What's my home work membership? For example, if 5 times a day my location shows that I'm in a mosque, what does that say about me? If my location shows that I'm in a synagogue, what does that show about me? So location can be much more than just your longitude and latitude. It's also where I've been. Where was I? It's also where I'm not, because the ability to profile helps you understand normal patterns of behavior. Where am I heading? What route did I travel by? What way am I facing, and what elevation am I at? Why is that important? Well, we have the development of interactive advertising billboards. We'll be talking to smartphones. And you're not going to spend a lot of money advertising something to target me if I'm facing this way and the billboard's this way. I was recently in Kuala Lumpur in the Two Towers, wonderful building. I wished I had indoor positioning, actually, because I got lost. And I just wanted to be able to help find my way around and find the store. So what way am I facing and what elevation? Going to be important. But it's also, location is often about people that I'm connected to as well, because many of the applications we have now are SO-MO-LO, social, mobile, location. How do we create for these contexts? How do we deal with these contexts? It's also about the places and things that I'm connected to, because my use of location services are increasingly contextual. I might be here, I might have met Steve, and I might say, Steve, do you know of a good restaurant? No, let's find one. We'll use this particular mobile application. I'm not going to name one. One is better than the other in my experience at the moment. But, you know, and it may be that I want to find the restaurant. I want that to hook up to find my friends. So it creates a very rich circle, context of data. And the difficulty is understanding what data and what's shared with. So one mobile application, for example, there's a wonderful game. It's used by hundreds of millions of people around the world, and I'm sure it's on your devices. That shares data with about 7 different entities, including your unique device identifier, including your location data. So, and it's also about where I was when I bought things. This is the complexity that we're in. So when we have policymakers, regulators, and others, and there's some in this room who really get this point, how do we do this? There's the user in the middle. In this global, interconnected, and interdependent ecosystem that is the mobile of today, I have a relationship with all of these. Using one app, one service can involve all of these collecting elements of my data. So from a regulatory point of view, when we talk about trans-border data flows, when we talk about giving somebody notice, giving somebody choice, and there are 7 different entities in one application sharing my data, does that mean 7 sets of notices? Does it mean 7 sets of consents? How do we create a framework of accountability that deals with informational responsibilities in the value chain? And this is what's important. And Chris mentioned that you know, our association has been working with our operators and others in the industry, and we've produced some mobile application privacy design guidelines. We've established mobile privacy principles. Why did we do that? Because we had members in territories where there were no formal data protection and legal frameworks, but where consumers had begun to express concerns, had begun to raise their privacy interests. So privacy interests are expectations, needs, wants, concerns. So some of those members have joined this because they want to do the right thing. They think that you should begin designing products and services with respect for privacy in mind. Designing things for user experiences. Do many of the laws that we have at the moment shape user experience? Does it consider user experience? If I think in Europe and the proposals on consent and transparency and choice, it's going to burden users with more. I'll just be a couple more minutes, Chris. But I think we've got to think differently about how we frame legal frameworks that also considers user experience. Because in the UK at the moment, we have the cookie rules implemented where you have to give your consent. Actually, that's undermining people to privacy because they're getting rid of these notices simply because they are so burdensome on the user journey. So we've got to think differently. How can we engage people in managing their privacy? And this is important. Just look at this. These are the different entities. You might see some logos that appear in many different sectors here that cut across. And that's really important. What I'd like to see the ability, I'd like to see privacy and security built in at the heart of the OS so that I can set my preferences. Because one of the challenges here, how do we design privacy, choice, and notice that's human readable? You know, Chris talked about the problems of reading stuff on mobile devices. There's research from Alberta University in Canada that shows that the ability to comprehend a privacy notice on a mobile phone is 47% less than on a desktop. Recently, thanks to changes in my OS and the cloud contract that came with it, I had to read 23,693 words. That's how much of a privacy geek I am, because I wanted to understand what this meant. Those days are just, it's impossible to help someone manage their privacy with 23,000 words. So it's global, right? This is a company that looked at the IP address, and this is a valid use of IP addresses. They wanted to know where apps were being developed. Because the wonderful thing that I love about the internet is that it creates opportunities all around the world. An app developer in Nairobi can develop apps for people in Europe and send their kids to school by the livelihood that they earn. Fantastic. So here, we see that apps are developed all over the world, used all over the world. I'm in Europe, in UK, I download an app from an app store in the US. The app developer is in Nairobi or Australia or somewhere else. The app developer in the freemium economy, most apps are free, but they're not free really. They're free because the app developer has done a deal with advertisers and others and inserted code in there that shares data in order to understand your behavior, in order to target you. So how do we do that? Because privacy in mobile is regulated by a patchwork of geographically bound laws. But we talked about privacy interests. You remember, I have my expectations, my needs, my wants, my concerns. They transcend these geographically bound, well, these borders of these geographically bound laws. So how do we create a framework? Is it possible to create legal frameworks that give me privacy protection? Or is it that we have self-regulatory initiatives? Do they care about privacy? Absolutely. We conducted research on over 4,000 consumers in Spain, Singapore, and UK. We're just doing research in Mexico and in Brazil, which will be out in December. Overwhelmingly, people are concerned about their privacy on mobile phones, but what's interesting is that they also value services. They want choice. So 70% of people value location-based services and location-based advertising, but 81% want to be asked for permission to share their data. And do you remember that nice slide on the ecosystem? Yanis knows what I'm going to say. This is my punchline. The only thing that's consistent in that ecosystem is the lack of consistency in approach to privacy. That doesn't help consumers. If we have consistent privacy experiences, you help people become familiar with the fact that something has consequences and implications for them. 57% of people that we asked want consistent rules to apply to location. I can skip this because you want to move on, so that's fine. That's us. I hope it's been of some use. I am going to stick around. Do ask me questions. I'm not shy.
Thank you, Pat. I wanted to key off some of the comments you made. I think one issue that Pat raised effectively is how to put the user in control in a very complex ecosystem. And he pointed out some of the problems with relying on existing regulation that may be outdated, pointed to some of the guidelines that GSMA has come out with. And I'd like to ask, I think one of his main points was putting the privacy into the operating system layer, which is a technological solution. I'd like to ask Peter if he has any views on what the ultimate solution is, or any reaction to what Pat may have said in terms of legal standards, best practices, and giving the user control.
Thank you very much. Well, there are no ultimate solutions at all. Not here and not in other fields of data protection and technology. But I agree completely on Pat's idea to integrate privacy into the core of systems. So the operational systems are the right location for location data. Everybody who owns a smartphone, everybody who owns a navigation system, appreciates services provided basing on these geolocation data. But on the other hand, most users care about their privacy. So this is our problem, and how to solve this. We have different ways of regulation. One is the non-regulation, and let the markets play its role, and perhaps they come to the best solutions. I'm sure this would not work. We experience that more and more data are produced by technological means, and even geolocation data are produced by devices and by also by network providers, and both parts are put together, and both previous speakers said the correct or described the problem in completely the correct way. So the second solution would be to set up legal rules, regulation. I would say this is the traditional way we as data protection community act, and we require some legal requirements. We require a legal framework that is binding for all players. But we see this approach has limits in the globalized world, because legal requirements may help in local applications and local services, but it is hard to come to convincing solutions in this way in international data flows and in services that are provided worldwide. This is not an advocacy against rules, but we have to be aware that our rules are not accepted all over the world, and we have also difficulties to enforce them. So we have a third idea. It is not completely new, but it is named privacy by design. Privacy by design means that there must be also some technological requirements that could be also enshrined in laws, in written legislation. But that must be transposed into technical means and technological solutions. And I think especially in this area of geolocation data, we need more privacy by design. And what should this mean? On the one hand, I would say it is not enough to limit the use of geolocation data, because the use of geolocation data depends on those who have the control on the data, who can access the data. And if there are apps using or having access, getting access to geolocation data and transferring the data in completely different continents, our system will not work anymore. So if we discuss privacy by design, we have to discuss which data will be released, which kind of data, for example. If there is a geolocation, why it is necessary to disclose also the unique ID. Why it is necessary to disclose, to transfer also the telephone number of the phone number of the owner. Why it is necessary to give other identifiable information to third parties. In many cases, services basing on geolocation data can be provided without knowing personal details and without identifying the individual. So, smart solutions from the perspective of data protection and privacy by design means the prevention of identified or identifiable data. This is one principle, and I think this must be enshrined in a very low layer of the technological systems, in the operation systems, is a good proposal, I would say. And then you need standards how and who can access this data. Well, second will be that technologies should give back, or should give, perhaps not back, give the control on the data to the users. And it's completely clear that the written consent is not the appropriate way to release a specific data or set of data or so. So I would say we need privacy by default, but we have to distinguish between different contexts, and in this contextual solution could be protected by legal requirements, enforcement, as well as by technological means. Giving back the control means that that the individual not has formally to click on a click box, but perhaps the preferences of the individual could be integrated in the device. We know such solutions from the P3P standard. Some of you know this. This was not really a success story, but the idea is very smart and very modern to protect privacy by technological means. That means that I define my privacy preferences, and the privacy preferences are translated into technological or technical terms. So the criteria, when the device releases what it knows about me and about my location, depends on my preferences. So the owner or the concerned individual must be in control on his or her own data. And the release must be minimized to the really necessary quantity. And it should be, as far as possible, limited to those services and those third parties that need the data for providing me with the advantages of these devices or provide me with these services. So it is very necessary to implement privacy in the technology. Third issue of privacy by design might be also that you get means to get back your data. So how could this happen? If you release data to a third party, you should remain in control, more or less. It's not 100% solution. On this data that is released to this third party or to the provider of a service, so that you have the right to control and to decide what happens with your data. So if we go this way, we can, I think, may be successful, even if there is more technology integrated in technological devices. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Before I get the other panelists involved, I just want to follow up on one thing Peter said and one thing Pat said. It sounds like there is a lot of responsibility being placed at the feet of the operating system providers. It sounds like the recommendations are that the best way to build privacy into the services and the best way to give users the control they desire is to have the operating system undertake certain actions. And I'd like to ask Pat, it's a point he raised initially, is there a way to have the operating systems undertake this responsibility without binding rules or legislation that would require them to do so?
Well, is that on? This one? Okay. I think some of the changes that I've seen in the operating systems have come about because of press headlines. And we think in the US to LocationGate that involved a number of the top internet companies. And they changed their business practices as a result of that. I think you need guidelines, though, Chris, because when we talk to developers around the world, and recently I sat with an organization which represents 5,000 developers in Nairobi, a brilliant service being done there. And what they say is that privacy is left to all of these big players in the ecosystem that seem to control the ecosystem, but they do things differently. What they want is to be able to build things with privacy in mind, build it quick and easy, get it out to the market easy, but that doesn't exist. I mean, you've got the California Attorney General's office is looking at producing best practice recommendations in mobile privacy. You've got another federal data protection commissioner soon will publish some, as far as I'm aware. You have the Japanese government looking at publishing mobile app guidelines. You have the Norwegian government wanting to publish mobile app guidelines. But you know what? What's common to all of these is about improving consumer transparency and improving consumer choice. So surely, in that chart on the ecosystem, we ought to be able to do things for consumers in a meaningful way. Not quite what we wanted, but there you go.
Thank you, Pat. I'd like to ask Beatrice now if she has a comment on some of the ideas that have come up. One question I will ask her is, do you think the mobile industry is doing enough to manage some of the privacy and security risks that we've been discussing? What's your view on the adequacy of their efforts, whether legal standards are necessary as well to improve privacy and security on mobile?
Bueno, estoy totalmente de acuerdo también con lo que dice Peter en cuanto a todo lo que tiene que ver con el diseño que se haga de los nuevos celulares que puedan aparecer. También no solamente creo que se tiene que ver los diferentes roles que ocupan las personas, no solamente las compañías, sino también el propio usuario. La compañía en sí, cuando le vende al usuario el smartphone o el teléfono de última generación, tendría que avisar que tiene determinado sistema de geolocalización que muchas veces el propio usuario no sabe que existen dentro de su teléfono. Y muchas veces también tendríamos que educar a las personas para que ellos sepan que por más que nosotros demos nuestros datos con nuestro consentimiento, también hay veces que esos datos se toman sin nuestro consentimiento y existen principios en todo lo que tiene que ver con la protección de datos que deberían estar siempre presentes, como el principio de consentimiento, el principio de finalidad, el principio de proporcionalidad, porque también al principio cuando Endre habló todo sobre si los empleadores necesitaban tener o no los datos de sus empleados, por dónde van, por ejemplo, las flotas de los camiones, si realmente mediante un celular no solamente tienen que geolocalizar a sus empleados mientras están en horario de trabajo, sino que también tienen que decirles que después que termina su horario de trabajo tendrían que desconectar ese dispositivo para que su vida íntima no estuviese geolocalizada, que supieran si van, como dijo Pat, a un templo budista o a un templo judío. Todo eso también debíamos tenerlo en cuenta. Por eso a mí me parece que no solamente ver toda la parte tecnológica, sino que buscar el equilibrio en todo lo que hay entre la privacidad y la tecnología, ¿no? Y sí, también necesitamos muchas veces para eso tener normativa. El problema que tenemos es la normativa en sí siempre está en forma territorial. Entonces tenemos que ver qué pasa cuando pasan las barreras de los diferentes estados. Actualmente es todo una globalización. Bueno, como siempre, uno de los temas importantes que tenemos dentro de lo que es esta nueva vida sin fronteras es todo lo que tiene que ver con la legislación y la jurisdicción. Entonces, creo que son cosas que debemos tener en cuenta, ¿no? No sé.
Thank you, Beatrice. I think Pat had a comment to follow on as well.
Yeah, you sort of answered it in the last section when you talked about the borderless world. And I think what we need to bear in mind is when I was in Nairobi with these guys and I was talking about the new European regulation that's going to be proposed, and the idea in Europe is that these regulations will apply to anybody around the world, any company around the world that processes data about European citizens or that otherwise targets those European citizens or profiles those European citizens. And do you know what the developers in Nairobi said? Well, who's going to help me understand those laws? Who's going to help me pay for the legal advice where I can only just afford to send my children to school? Does that mean I no longer have a livelihood because I can't comply with these European rules?
Well,
Go ahead.
well, I think we had such a very similar discussion, I think, yesterday. The question is, what would be the consequence not to regulate? Should we really give the parliament, the legislator, the advice to stop legislation and to leave it to the industry? I would not say you don't propose that, of course, but it's clear. But so who will give the guidance? This is a real political and legal problem, and there is no ideal solution if you do not think that there will be a binding international standard in all over the world. It is a theoretical construct that would be the best way. But if we are there, if we are going in this direction, I don't know. I don't think that will happen in my lifetime. I'm a little bit skeptical. There are also many who are younger, as I am, so they should not lose their hope. But what do we do now? I would say guidance is one way, cooperation is one way, discussion is one way, as we do this here, and sometimes we give also guidance in our international conferences. For example, on IP version 6. This is only a very specific system. But on the geolocation via using IP addresses. So we have to give guidance as data protection community worldwide, and I think we are not so far away from each other. The problem is that the world is not a privacy community. So how to convince the others? That is a question, and one way I proposed was to go ahead in defining technological standards and solutions, perhaps spreading them by best practices and also including them in our legal systems as the European directives and European regulations. So this is our way we go, and I am sure this will influence also other parts of the world. In Europe are living 500 million citizens. That means there are living 500 million potential customers. It's a huge market. Even the big players cannot ignore this huge market. If you see, on the other hand, our member states, even the biggest, are not in this position as Europe is. So, if we define standards that are practical, if we give guidance in a way that can be also transposed and lived by those who use the technology and those who provide the technology and even to those who provide services, then this can go ahead, not in, I said this before, not in the way we get to a 100% solution, but perhaps 80%. That would be better than now.
Thank you, Peter. I think the comment on standards is a very important one. I think we're seeing that a bit in the World Wide Web Consortium with Do Not Track. This is a situation where there are not consistent legal standards internationally, certainly, and yet there is an effort underway to develop a system, a standard that would work across borders. We'll see how that shakes out in the end, but I think the pursuit of standards can be an important way to bridge the gap between inconsistent legal measures. I wanted to ask Andre for his views. He talked about legal standards in his presentation, and we've talked on the panel a lot about the adequacy of legal standards and whether more is needed to address some privacy and security risks, and I'd like to see if he has a comment on that.
Sorry, what exactly?
What's your view on whether legal standards are sufficient to address privacy concerns or if additional measures are warranted, best practices, standard setting, as Peter and Pat have discussed?
Yeah, I see. Well, if we look around the world and we are now in a lucky situation that many countries are represented here. We see that there is a legislative fever in the world. I mean that the European Union is drawing up a new legislation, a new data protection package is being negotiated. The US has a proposal on privacy bill of rights. APEC countries are just reviewing their standards. OECD standards are being reviewed. Council of Europe standards are being reviewed. It suggests me that if we come, and now come back to what Peter has said, that I think the legislator will remain the key player as regards international standards. I'm a bit skeptical that industry and self-regulation will be sufficient when solving global problems. I'm a lawyer. I do believe that the very heart of enforcement remains at national level. Concrete data subjects, concrete DPAs, this remains in the heart of the enforcement. And I think that must be kept in mind. If it comes to privacy concerns, we have to think globally, but enforce locally.
One additional remark. I would say I completely agree with Andre, but we have to do this on more or less common principles and rules. So I would appreciate it that in Europe there will be a better harmonization and a better cooperation between our authorities. This will be also, it would be good for the industry as well as for the individuals who are concerned.
I would, Pat, hang on one second. I want to make sure the audience understands that we do want to invite a dialogue with the audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and let me get Pat to respond first, and then I'll come back to you.
Only one thing that I meant to say while I was up there, and that Peter's just reminded me of, is that, you know, we talk about consistent rules, and yet in Europe, and Jakob has written a paper with his colleagues on this, we have cellular location data is strictly regulated by a piece of law that only applies to mobile operators or fixed line operators, but wireless LAN and GPS is not subject to those same rules. So if we talk about the fact that what is important here is to create a level of awareness to help people manage and simpler ways for people to understand and control their data, how can we expect them to understand that different laws apply to different sets of data with different consequences, with different rights applying to those laws? I don't think we can do that anymore.
Right. That sounds almost like the need for an updated national regulation, perhaps some sort of international standard.
Well, we have such different fields, and this distinction between telecommunications on the one hand and other services, even internet service on the other, is not appropriate. It is completely clear. We have this on the national level, as in Germany. We have strict rules. You are completely right on location data in Germany, how to use them, but almost no rules for handling geolocation data in other services. So even if the location or the geolocation is much more precise, then can be carried out by cell ID or so, by the network operator. So we need more consistency. It's completely clear. And to be frank, I mentioned this yesterday evening in a private conversation with my British colleagues. I would say the next step of the European regulatory reform will be a reform of the privacy directive. It must be, because it is not really in consistency with the current discussed data protection package. So, but we have to go step by step. Now this is this basic regulation, and then we must modernize and make consistent other pieces of legislation with these general principles. But at first we have to discuss the general principles and the general methods, how we should deal with these questions.
Thank you. Question?
Hi, thank you. Stephen McCartney from Google. My worry is that we've started today in a conversation about empowering individuals, and we've ended up talking about rules and regulations. And, I mean, I think Pat's point is a point that maybe hasn't come back to enough on the panel, and that is we need to engage consumers. Pat, can you get your slide up about the ecosystem? I mean, I'm more than happy to have conversations about how we make our operating systems better. That's all good, but a lot of this in this ecosystem is done where notice is given to the individual by an apps developer who isn't the operating system provider. The individual gives their consent, and then the data is going. And, you know, I can see you rolling your eyes, Peter, but this is what's happening, and we don't make all the apps. So, you know, we're not the controller. So I know there's an element of, well, Google would say that, wouldn't they? But I do want this. This is a serious point, and I'm not making it as Google. I'm making it as an individual who cares about privacy. And so that's my first worry. I think we need to have a broader conversation about how we engage individuals, because rules and regulations won't cut it. And I would say that because I shudder to think about how it looks on a worldwide stage whenever a European Data Protection Authority takes on an individual app developer in Nairobi. So I think we need to have a conversation about how we engage individuals more on this so that they understand the choices that they're making.
Let me just respond initially, and then I'll turn it over to Peter. I think we did discuss engaging the individual on how to understand what's going on. I think that is a very important component of this. You know, it seems to me that the operating system provider is in a really good position to be the first entity to engage the individual. And I think that is a point that some of us on the panel were making. Peter, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I completely share the view that we are not the key players. The key players are the individuals, and we have to identify their interest, and we have to give them the power to control, to get back or to get control on their data. And the formal consent is not the best solution. It is clear. We have learned this morning, that we have to read, I think, 76 days data protection and privacy statements. We have to decide about if we only take 10 minutes for each. So it is not the best solution. So my idea would be, I buy a cell phone, a car, or perhaps also other mobile devices, and I am sure that my data by default is not released to others unless it is necessary for providing the basic services and for providing also functioning of society. So there are also needs for society to release some data. So I would say this is one understanding we have to get. And the second would be how to manage control, even if it is very complicated. So the one solution could be in the way that I will not be asked every time a piece of data is asked by any other player, but we need technology to help the individual to set preferences and to practice his preferences.
I think Pat is very eager to jump in here.
I mean, we're working with academics and others that are looking at how the software the code, the OS, can learn from context, and the context in which I make privacy decisions, and then it begins to set and take those decisions for me moving forward, with me always having control of that. So one thing at a very simple level, for example, is where it learns the context in which I reject a call. So where am I? What kind of meeting am I in? Who am I connected to? The next time, it might make that decision for me. So there's some very intelligent stuff coming along. And also, for example, another one uses haptics to you can shake your mobile phone to set your location settings, which is much preferable, I think, and better than the thing where I was caught out because I'd forgotten that I had geotagged. I think there's some very interesting things coming about, but I know more people want to speak. So.
Any other questions at this point? In the front.
Gracias. Mirna García de México. Mi pregunta es para Peter, para saber si entendí correctamente lo que... Trato de resumir lo que dijo en esta ponencia y lo interpreté de la siguiente manera. Me parece en efecto que no es solo una cuestión de regulación, porque ya sabemos que las leyes pueden estar más allá del cumplimiento. No sé si lo ideal sea que seamos nosotros como consumidores o usuarios tecnológicos los que maduremos a través de la información y podamos servirnos de la tecnología sin entregarnos definitivamente a ellos. ¿Por qué? Porque ese gran universo de usuarios, de consumidores, somos los que podemos definir, incluso más allá de la regulación, si un producto o un producto tecnológico se va a adaptar a nosotros o no en función de la manera en la que respeten las reglas de la privacidad. Y ese sería el punto número 1. Y el punto número 2, me parece que el tema de la geolocalización como una derivación de un derecho de privacidad no puede ser, como una libertad en términos de privacidad, no puede ser enteramente absoluto, tiene que haber cierta relatividad y quiero poner 2 ejemplos básicos. En materia de administración de justicia e investigación de delitos, es muy importante para poder prevenir o para poder identificar a los responsables. En lo particular, yo utilicé la geolocalización cuando trabajé en la Procuraduría de mi país, para, a veces con órdenes judiciales o extrajudiciales, para poder ayudar a la investigación de personas secuestradas. Y eso fue absolutamente exitoso. Pero también conocí de delitos que se pudieron perpetrar a partir de la geolocalización indebida de ciertas personas. Entonces sí me parece que hay que poner reglas claras, pero básicamente es un ejercicio que más vamos nosotros a llevar hacia allá a las empresas, independientemente de la regulación local o extramuros que pueda existir, y no sé si estoy correcta, Peter.
Thank you for your question. Well, I think you interpreted my speech, my message in the correct way, because at first we need major consumers, major citizens who have to decide about what they are doing. But the problem is that the complexity of technology is on a level that makes it even for experts hard to understand what's going on with the data. So there's a requirement for those who provide this technology to construct it in a way that in the most cases, by default, privacy settings prevent the individual from tracking and tracing and surveillance and profiling and so on. This is one thing. But if the individual wants services that are dangerous or risky, or if they want to release their data, by which reasons ever, we have not to decide about them. They should have the right to do this. This is one. Second, of course, privacy is a basic right, is a fundamental right, but it is not the only fundamental right, and it is not the only reasoning of our societies. The prevention of crime is necessary. There are property rights, and other competing rights. So our work is, and it's a work for the legislator as well as for those who decide on standards, to come to the right decisions. What is the right decision? What is the right balance is not even easy to answer. My answer to the question, how far should geolocation data could be used and should be used for preventing crime or also for investigation and for law enforcement, is that if location data is there and there are serious crimes, law enforcement authorities must have the right to get access to this data for this specific purpose in dedicated cases. But this should not be a justification for a preventive collection of all those data that is not needed for the services. So we have to distinct between preventive data retention. We have this debate in Europe. It's a very intense debate. And dedicated use of existing data. My answer is, if there is existing data and perhaps also if there is an ongoing investigation, the data could be used and should be used, but not in prevention of those of crimes and other things what could happen. The data should be collected without any need.
Yeah, I'll have Andre go and then Pat.
Thank you. I would like to add something to the questions our Mexican colleague raised. We are speaking about basically the legal basis of the processing. Once the controller would like to base its processing on the consent of the data subject, then it must be noted that as long as the controller does not do its best to inform the data subject about the circumstances of the processing, then as long the legal basis of the processing, the whole legal basis of the processing may be challenged. So I think, and this is why we are speaking about much about it, because we think that this is a weak point of these sort of processings. So lack of information and technical difficulties as well.
Only that not only was I CPO that used to design apps and work with developers, but I used to run a team of people that did government interception and disclosure. I've worked and prevented kids being abducted, and I've worked on kidnapping and terrorism cases. I understand where you're coming from. I think in this complexity here, the data that you want and seek may not be even in Mexico, but I think what's key for me here is that you have a justified and proportionate legal framework that's premised on core human rights principles that regulates the investigatory powers of the state. And that framework must clearly set a citizen's rights, expectations to privacy, so that the citizen can be aware of the circumstances under which their privacy will be infringed. And I think that's paramount in any democracy today.
On the expectation of privacy, I like this word, because if everybody expects that he is surveilled everywhere, there's no expectation of privacy. So the key issue is what are our practices. I would say expectation of privacy is not the correct criteria we need. The question is what is adequate, what is proportionate. And you also mentioned that, but proportionality is not the same as expectation of privacy, because bad practices could move then the threshold, and this could not be the solution.
Beatriz, did you want to speak to this as well?
Sí. Cuando nosotros hablamos sobre todo sobre los derechos humanos, la protección de datos, al ser un derecho humano, también tenemos que tener conciencia de que existen también otros derechos humanos, como el de la vida, como decía ella, del secuestro, o lo que tenemos ahora en nuestro país, que se está dando, lo de la violencia doméstica. Tenemos que tener en cuenta qué es lo que va a primar, ¿no? Si el derecho a la vida, si el derecho a la protección de datos. Entonces, como siempre, necesitamos en cada caso saber qué es lo que vamos a hacer y qué es lo que no vamos a hacer, ¿no? A pesar de estar recolectando datos. Por supuesto que estoy de acuerdo en que datos preventivos no se tendrían que recolectar, pero siempre ver qué es lo que prima, ¿no? Porque los derechos humanos, por más humanos que sean, no son absolutos. Entonces, tenemos que ver eso.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? One more. Hi,
I
Lily.
have one. Hi, Chris. This is Lily Coney with Epic. There are a couple of issues here. The practical application of those who create cell phones. I've seen Apple iPhone updates where they're trying to do more and more with privacy, adding a privacy button, and a couple of clicks down, you can actually turn off locational privacy, alerting you when an application tries to access your address book or your location, and you can make a decision right then. But there are also some things that are happening where they're putting applications on where you have no control, like the electronic wallet or the voicemail feature, which I think is above and beyond the app developer realm, but getting into a realm where the companies themselves are putting on features that customers don't have granular control over. The second piece is back to how do you write privacy protective applications? Application writers are not learning in colleges and universities, they're learning from each other. So if there is some thinking around this, around privacy by design, there could be remote opportunities for people to learn how to write applications that are privacy-centric, using academic research institutions or academic institutions to develop modules so that someone in Nairobi obviously has computer access, could log on and get a tutorial in their language on how to do the applications correctly. They're not lawyers, they're not going to care about that part, but they do want to make sure that their applications are available to our market. So I was just thinking that may be something to think about if we think about it in the terms of privacy by design.
Thank you, Lily. I think the education of the application developer community is critical. I know that that's been ongoing recently, the Application Developers Alliance, the Association for Competitive Technology, and the trade associations, CTIA, GSMA. That effort is ongoing, and that is an area, I think, of significant concern. There are so many application developers out there, and in many cases, they get their software code from third parties. Do they really understand what software they're getting and what capability is built into that software? That's an important question. That actually leads to, I think, a wrap-up question that I would like to ask all the panelists, which is, we've had a lot of discussion about technological developments, about the development of standards, about interesting technology that's on its way, coming down the pike to give users more control over their information, especially their geolocation information. Talking about standards that can bridge the gap between national and international frameworks. But what is the most important thing that we can do today, short of, or in advance of a standard, in advance of technological developments? What should we be doing as regulators, as trade associations, as academics, to give users more information about what's happening and give them more control about the information collection and use practices? So I'll start with Pat and then move down the line.
Okay. I hear a lot of industry sectors talk about the importance of coming together in stakeholder dialogue. I hear the words, but I see very little action. And I think the thing that needs to happen is for industry to come together. All these players in this ecosystem must come together, because the user is a consumer, a customer of each of these entities in this ecosystem. And sometimes, we talk about privacy nudges, about how to encourage people to make an appropriate privacy decision. Maybe it needs a regulatory nudge to get some of these players together, to be honest. And you need them to do it.
Beatrice, did you want to comment?
Sí, creo que tenemos que tener en cuenta los costos-beneficios que nos trae la geolocalización. Por supuesto que todo va a depender de qué lado estemos, ¿no? Si de la industria, si del usuario, si de la parte que va a regular. Entonces ahí tenemos que ver para qué lado es que tendemos nuestra normativa o nuestras buenas prácticas.
Well, you asked, what can we do? My perspective is the perspective of Data Protection Authority, and I think we can cooperate better. We can try to come to a more consistent enforcement, and we have to cooperate with data protection authorities all over the world, as we do, even with the Federal Trade Commission, to exchange views, to exchange also information on ongoing investigations, and so on. This is the first step. It's not enough, but it's in the right direction.
Thank you. I'm also representing here a Data Protection Authority. One of our obligations is raising awareness. This means basically that we try to reach data subjects and educate them what are their rights, their opportunities. One of the messages I like passing to data subjects is that if they cannot avoid that their personal data are used, then at least let's bargain a good price for it.
Thank you very much. We probably have time for one last question, if there is one. Otherwise, we will release you all to coffee. All right. I want to thank all the panelists, and thank you for your attention.